Procedural due process. Okay, what does equal protection have to do with due process? Nothing. Substantive due process has to do with whether the law burdens a fundamental right. It's concerned with the actual right that is impaired and whether the government has the authority to impair that right. Does it burden a fundamental right? Strict scrutiny. It doesn't burden a fundamental right? Rational basis review. And we went through our 10 fundamental rights. Now let's talk about procedural due process. Procedural due process is all about fairness in procedure. The minimum process due is notice and an opportunity to be heard. Under Matthews versus Eldridge, if the government deprives someone of a procedural life, liberty, or property interest, there's a test to determine how much process is due. So here's our Matthews versus Eldridge 3-part test. Remember, what's the minimum? Notice and an opportunity to be heard. Okay, so under Matthews versus Eldridge, we look to what interest is the person seeking to protect, what interest is the government seeking to advance, and what fiscal or administrative burdens would the government incur. Okay, Matthews versus, talking about procedural due process. How much process is due? If our minimum is notice and opportunity to be heard, and our maximum is full trial with jury and witnesses, then how do we determine? We look to 1, the interest of the person. What are they seeking to protect? 2, what is the government's interest? What are they seeking to advance? And what burden would the government incur? Financial, administrative. All right, procedural due process. What are we talking about? Depriving someone of life, liberty, or property interest. And we're looking to balance the person's interest, the government's interest, with any fiscal or administrative burden on the government. All right, let's talk about life interests, liberty interests, and property interests. Life is pretty easy. If a person dies as a result of state action, then they have been deprived of their life. So how much process is due before you deprive someone of their life, as in executing someone as a result of state action? Well, that's a pretty high bar, right? For the death penalty, we do need the most process possible. Liberty interests are broadly defined as denial of physical freedom of movement. So life interest, if a person dies as a result of state action, they've been deprived of life. Liberty, they've been denied of their physical freedom. So a liberty interest would include freedom from confinement or incarceration. That includes mental health confinement, juvenile confinement, and even confinement as an enemy combatant. Liberty interests also go to smaller things, like a driver's license or, say, an operator's license, like a CDL, that enables an individual to travel for work. Those are liberty interests. Also, freedom to raise one's children is considered a liberty interest. So generally, a liberty interest is about, physical freedom of movement. So it would involve freedom from, confinement or incarceration, including for, mental health. We're going to need due process before we put someone in the insane asylum, put someone in juvenile hall, and it even protects who? Enemy combatants. Smaller things that deny someone their physical freedom of movement would be, a driver's license or operator's license that enables someone to work or travel. That is a liberty interest. And I'm not really sure why liberty interest includes freedom to raise one's children as a liberty interest and a fundamental right, but I'm just going with the outline. Finally, property interests. So when the government takes a person's benefits, professional licenses, that is a property interest. Okay, so what processes do? All right, well, let's first talk about public benefits. Remember Goldberg versus Kelly. Before someone is deprived of welfare benefits, we need what? That's right, notice and a hearing. Public employees, if they have a reasonable expectation of continuing employment, have due process rights. Public employment is a form of property interest. How do we know what kind of public employees or which public employees have a property interest in their employment? We're going to look to see if they can be terminated only for cause. So there are lots of ways that a public entity can structure their contracts so that public employees don't have a property interest. However, a public employee, if they are terminable only for cause, or if there's an employee manual or customs or policies that discuss methods of termination, public employees do have a property interest in their continued employment. One example would be a tenured professor at a public university. Okay, so professional licenses are also property interests. Wages that are subject to garnishment or taxation, those are a property interest. And the right to a public education. Education is not a fundamental right, but public education is a property interest. Okay, so procedural due process is all about fairness. If the government is going to deprive you of life, liberty, or property, they must give you, that's right, due process of law. And at minimum, what must they give you? That's right, notice and opportunity to be heard. And we're going to look at the Matthews versus Eldridge three-part test. The interest that the person seeks to protect, the interest the government seeks to advance, and the burden on the government, both financial and administrative. Okay, depriving someone of their life as a result of state action, that's pretty obvious. Liberty is always, that's right, physical freedom of movement, confinement, incarceration, insane asylum, juvenile hall, enemy combatants. And the smaller things like your driver's license, your CDL, and freedom to raise your children. Property interests, public benefits, public employees, if they have a reasonable expectation of continuing employment, your professional licenses, the right to a property interest is public education is a property interest. And of course, your wages are your property. Your tax refund is a property interest. Okay, so that's pretty much procedural due process. Let's try to repeat our Matthews versus Eldridge three-part test one more time. We're going to look to what is the interest of the person, what are they seeking to protect, what interest is the government seeking to do what? Advance, and what, that's right, fiscal or administrative burdens would the government incur. Okay, and what's our minimum process? That's right, notice and a hearing. And that's it for procedural due process.